So y'all, we're going to be talking about this whole concept of building a 6 and 7 figure business and basically why making $1 million in your business isn't everything, and just have some really transparent conversations around money goals, around setting income goals, because this time of year is notoriously noisy for going into 2022 planning and reflecting. And I think both of us have some really interesting ways that we think about money, in that like we both really want to make money and care about money and help our clients make money, but also like money is not the primary driver of why we do our work at all. And I think what's going to be so cool for you guys is getting to hear some of Lacey's journey, because are you in year 6 of business now?
Yeah.
Year 6, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's such a like beautiful thing that you get this perspective the longer you're in business too, and you get to like see what happened in that in-between process and kind of get to like actually more hindsight than when you're first building in that phase, right? You get to see things stack, and you get, lit up across the 7-figure mark last year. And so I think it's going to be such a gift for you to be able to provide some perspective from like having been where we're, so many people are at the beginning stages, but also kind of getting to see some of those tangible things come to fruition. So for folks who are new here, do you want to give a little bit of just a quick intro to who you are?
Sure. So I'm Lacey. My business is A Lit Up Life, and I have a master's in mental health counseling and an MBA, and I kind of combine those two to help my clients. The framework I work with people around is mindset, strategy, and execution. And I work with clients at all different levels of their business, from just starting out to multiple 7 figures to build and grow online. And I work pretty much almost entirely one-on-one with people to do that. And so like Shari was saying, we crossed the 7-figure mark last year off of one-on-one and a revenue share model doing that. So it's been a long journey to get there, but it's been really cool to see it happen from doing it by staying committed to doing the work that we love to do.
Yeah, I love that. And like Lacey is also like just a really good innovator in terms of like going first in our industry too, which like if you're here because of Lacey, which I know like several people are, like I think that's one of the things that's so cool too, is getting to like do it your way and have your own flavor of that, and also being brave enough to go first, especially around rev share and bringing that to the coaching space too. And if y'all are not familiar with revenue share, just like as quick context, revenue share is basically like where instead of paying a flat fee for coaching, there's also a percentage based, where based on the number of new revenue that you generate, that's kind of where the fee comes in. And so I also have incorporated that into my business model. I know like one of your clients and my coach has also incorporated that. And so I think it's just really cool to see how like you can have innovation, you can have people, taking it and adapting it and making their own. Because I know like all three have totally different numbers that we use in rev share and how we adapt that. And so I think it's just going to be really cool to talk about like, how do you take these goals that feel like there's one path or like 3 main paths to do it, and how do you make it your own, right? Because like a lot of people have shared, even, in us promoting this, that they also want to scale their business, but like there's reasons why they think they can't do it in a certain way. And I think that's what's going to be super cool about this conversation too.
Yes, totally. I mean, yeah, I think like in some ways that's what our industry is built on, is telling you there's supposed to be a specific way, because that's what makes you do the things and buy the programs to learn this specific way. And it's just kind of being able to like step outside that box a little bit to realize that what entrepreneurship is actually built on is doing it your own way, right?
Absolutely. One of what you just said is like so important, because most of us are not starting our businesses with the intention of like, I want to build $1 million business, right? Most of us are either like intentionally choose entrepreneurship for some lifestyle freedom or life experience, right? Or if you're like me, you're like pushed into entrepreneurship because you get fired for health reasons. And I'm so astounded how many people also have that similar story of like unexpectedly got fired, and it was kind of like the universe's way of like okay, you gotta go sink or swim.
Here's your time. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's also important is like the reason we get into it. And then once we're in it, all of these messages that just get really overwhelming really quickly when we're trying to learn around like, now the milestone and the target keeps moving from you need to like make an income and a good living to now you need to have 100K. Now you need to hit 10K months. Now that number is actually changing and it needs to be $1 million. And I keep hearing that target move like almost every year that I've been in business.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelming, 100%. Especially if one, you don't even desire to build a business at that level, or two, like you're just in process. Right. And like results take time. And like, of course, we're available for super fast results and things to look different than how we plan them. But the reality is like most things take time to manifest into the 3D world.
Yeah. I think like something I tell clients a lot is like, there's like norm and outliers, and we play to the norm, and we can still sometimes become an outlier in doing that. But I think almost everyone gets into this business trying to be an outlier immediately. And it's really hard to like force or hack that without setting up a lot of the like normative things that build a business and that create foundations and sustainability and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think like that's where the challenge point comes in our industry, is being able to shut out enough of that noise to like lay the foundation, do the thing, grow it over time. Like, you know, we didn't hit $1 million till our 6th year in business. And like, you know, I could tell one group of people that and they would think that was like insanely fast. And I could tell another group of people that and they would think it was insanely slow. And so it's just like keeping perspective through that.
Absolutely. And so one of the things I think that will be interesting to kind of share with people is just, you know, we both kind of have these different lenses or different flavors of the same thing around like how we think about money, and also even like getting to that $1 million mark or running that successful business. And I think it'd be really cool if you could share kind of like your concept of MillionHer and how that kind of fits into how you think about, you know, like getting to those money goals. If you are here and you do want $1 million business, or you do know that you want that, how do you kind of bridge that gap between being in the norm and being available to be an outlier?
Totally. I mean, for me, I think like the MillionHer concept is really about like, do you have a business and a life that makes you feel like a millionaire? Like before you even get there is kind of the point, right? And for everyone that looks different. You know, like I have clients who the thing that feels best to them is like making 6 figures while working 15 hours a week. And like, that is like that is the like dream for them. Like, yeah, they could make more, and they probably will, because their business will just compound and grow over time. But like, ultimately that's not like their biggest driving factor. Their biggest driving factor is to like have this work-life balance, spend a lot of time with their family, whatever. So the thing that our industry does, I think, a really terrible job at is like making any of that okay. It's basically like, you know, 6 figures or bust, and then 7 figures or bust, and then you have to hit multiple 7 figures. And it's like, there are these markers that get put into our head where it's like, you're not successful unless this thing has happened. And so for me, it's just important to like redefine what that means. And so something I've said a lot is like, I have felt like a millionaire in my business long before I was one. And that's why I got there, is kind of the point. It's because I liked my business so much that I stayed running it for the last 6 years, which is what it took for us to grow and get there. And so I think that that's the point that I really always want to drive home, is that like your success and your version of like what would be like the most ideal for you gets to look however you want it to look. And like, if anything in our industry is telling you that you're not a good enough X coach, service provider, whatever, if you haven't made a certain amount, like you're just paying attention to the wrong stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the questions that comes up for me, or that did come up for me during my journey, was like, why do we even latch onto that message if it's not resonant for us? And like, how do we detach from that if we've somehow, you know, like let it into our mind's world? Like, what are some of the ways that we detach from that? Because I think from what I've heard you share, like you've had like pretty good discernment from the beginning of like, this is what I want, and like putting my blinders on. but like that's a skill that like most of us have to develop pretty strong boundaries around. And it was
Yeah,
definitely something that like after my first year, I was like, this feels like shit. I'm gonna have to go in instead of out. And like now I feel like I've got really good discernment there, but I've had to cultivate it. I'm just really curious, like what are some ways that you do that intentionally?
Well, I think like what sort of happens in our space is that the people who are, you know, like making that money, I mean, I'm about to be dramatic, but I kind of think it's true. But like we almost treat it like they've like found the cure to cancer or something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like it feels that dramatic in our space sometimes, and it gets marketed like all your problems go away, everything's perfect.
Yes.
So it just makes so much sense that we get caught up in that because we have these people that we put on a pedestal. We feel like they have found the secret and they have become devoid of any challenges and whatever. And I think the reason I've always been able to have a lot of discernment is because I had a lot of experiences leading up to this that made me realize that that probably wasn't true. So one, I was a therapist. And when you're a therapist, you realize like everybody has shit, no matter what. And then two, you know, in business school, you spend most of your time looking at like, what did big businesses fuck up?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of like doing case studies around that and stuff. So I think I already came in with this lens of like, no human's perfect, no business is perfect.
Normalized like a lot more.
Yeah, I had years of normalization of that, right? And so then when I saw the marketing that was like, oh, look, this human and this business are perfect, like right away my like, you know, like alarms went off and was like, oh, but really, I don't know, you know? And I think the truth is it's just easy to get caught up in that marketing. And I get why it's so easy to get caught up in it because that's what we want. I mean, you know, most of us desire to be perfect and not have challenges and all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, it's like such a normal experience. But I think like really keeping my eye on the idea that like that isn't real. And then again, just working with enough clients to see that that's not real. Like,
yeah,
that has always been so useful for me. I think just knowing that like it can be good and my business is really good and I love so much of it and there's so many good things about it. But like truly I don't feel that much different having crossed 7 figures than I did when I crossed 6 or whatever. And like it's just seeing that perspective.
Yeah, I really like that because like that's kind of like, you know, your and I think what's so cool about Alas Human is, and like really connects back to what you're saying, is like remembering that there's no way to evade the human experience. And like that was such a lesson for me. I think specifically I'm going into my 3rd year of business. And so like in year 1, that was like the brain kept wanting to be like, it sounds like there's a version where I don't have to have this human experience.
Yeah, it seems like people are having this and I want them to tell me about it.
And like, it's kind of true, but like the way that you kind of like tap out of like the worst human experiences is almost by like managing your relationship to it emotionally than it is about like changing the circumstance, right?
Totally.
And so like that's I think 100% what you're talking about with like I felt this way before the 3D reality even showed up for me. And I think that's true too, right? Like we can be doing the exact same thing and feel shitty in it and do the same thing and feel great. And it's almost not about the task or the goal or any of that. It's like our relationship to it, right? Do we think this means that we're a good person or a bad person, a good coach or a bad coach, you know, whatever that flavor is.
Yep.
And I think one of the things that I'm so passionate about as well is like, it's also just more than our thoughts, right? It's not just about, this is why I like chose the word well-being, because I felt like mindset and self-care was like a real trend at one point. And people were like, you do all this self-care and like, let's hack the mindset. And like, I know you and I have had some conversations and you've had this with your community of like mindset or well-being is like a really robust word and concept that really has to acknowledge the fact that you are a human in a human experience, and not just the fact that like you get to like believe your way out of what you want, but you almost have to meet yourself where you're at and accept that present before you can even be available to create some of these other things in the future and enjoy them, right? Because you can manifest a lot of money from a really bad emotional place It's just then it feels not fun to hold and you don't want to sustain it, right?
Exactly. 100%. Like there's always like, I mean, repercussions is the word that comes up, but there's kind of like always repercussions or trade-offs that we're going to experience when we're coming from that place. And it doesn't mean pretend that place doesn't exist. It means like actually deal with it, look at it, work through it.
Yeah, treat yourself like, yeah, you're almost like we're constantly reconciling these two parts of ourselves, and there's like the higher self, the internal self, whatever, that can like see beyond all of the fear, but there's also this very real human body and brain, and our brains sometimes need time to get on board, and our bodies also have, you know, limits and like capacity almost. And I'm really excited for the second part of our conversation because I'm curious about like how pregnancy has kind of been through that experience. But I think like sometimes we're so quick to bypass the human part of it. Like the fact that we need sunlight and food and space. And as an entrepreneur, especially if you're holding a lot and your job is as a coach or a space holder, you almost need to be even more gentle with yourself than like maybe you were used to in your previous job, because that's what it takes to be able to hold it long term, right? It's not just about like, how do I get done and get the content? It's almost like, how do I keep wanting to like enjoy this process so I keep putting out content, instead of like, let me power my way through and like make it to this mark, and then now I don't want to go any further.
Yeah, I had a call with one of my clients the other day, and we were kind of joking about how I just have like a super low tolerance for feeling bad. Like I have such a low tolerance for that, which has actually served me really, really well in this business, because when something has made me feel really bad, or like I had to hustle through it or power through it or whatever, I've been really, really quick to change it, because I don't tolerate that very well. And I think that, you know, as women and as business owners, sometimes we can make that wrong, where we're like, I should be able to stick it out. I should be able to find the tools. I should be able to, you know, like make this work more. And I think like some of the magic of what I've been able to do in business is that I haven't put that on myself to be like, you should be able to figure that out. I'm more like, oh, I don't like things that don't feel good. So what else does?
I love that. I have that at least in my work life. I'm like very unavailable to be miserable in my job.
Yeah.
And so I totally resonate with that, and think it's a really like helpful lens too of making sure that like you're pouring into something that also gives back to you, right? You're not just like pouring into something. And I think this is a really good segue into like talking about money goals and how we even think about them, is like, also, it's not just about the money as like a symbol, but it's almost like about what is that money doing for you, and like what is your connection to that money goal, right? And like why are we pursuing the money? Not that like you have to have like a right enough reason, but almost just like something emotionally that you connect to. And so like that really makes the difference of like how it feels to be in pursuit of that too, right? If you're in pursuit of something that doesn't actually get you much, that's I find when we go into energetic depletion versus like when we're pursuing something that like feels worth it to us, like we're almost willing to put in those extra hustly things because they actually feel it's like an energizing hustle.
Exactly.
Hustle instead of like a bottomless pit of striving.
Yep. Totally.
And one thing I noticed that was super interesting for my clients when we've been talking kind of about setting intentions for 2022 and like what they want to call in, is I noticed like the majority of my clients actually don't have revenue goals as their top priority. Almost everyone, actually, everyone, their number one priority is a well-being goal. And I think that's super interesting. And, you know, I took the time to sit down with my own intentions, and like, my business is in my top 3 priorities, but it's my very last one. And so I think that's also super interesting. And I don't know if this is like a trend, and I've noticed this across income levels too. Like whether you're early on or like you're feeling good about your income, it's almost like when you are in the pursuit of money, you realize that the money wasn't really it. And so I'm curious if like you've noticed this too, or if this has shifted for you over your business, and kind of how you have this conversation with clients around like setting the money goals and how that interweaves with their own like connection to their well-being.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, and what I think I had to personally go through in my own journey, is like I had to get to a point where I didn't care about hitting the money goal before I could set money goals that felt good, if that makes sense. So when I decided to stick with a one-on-one model, I really had to do a lot of mindset processing around like, I might never have $1 million business. Like, what if I always just made 250K? Would I be okay with that? Like, what does that look like? And like, you know, again, depends on what group you're talking to. There's a whole group of people that are like, fuck off, you always made 250K. And then there's another group who would like die, you know, if like that was the limit. But for me, it was so important to get to that place where it was like, I would still feel good about myself, feel good about my business, feel good about the work I was doing, and feel really in integrity and all of those things. And it's almost like as soon as I locked into like, cool, nothing about me or my business or my success or my worth is tied into me making a certain amount, that's when I was able to then start actually setting some money goals and playing with things in a different way, because there was nothing attached to them. Like my worth or validation wasn't wrapped up in that, which is what this industry will trick us into doing.
Yeah.
And that's when I've like really been able to crush money goals, because I have a lot of detachment for them. Like even this year, and having, you know, wanting to hit 1 million, like I cared, but I honestly didn't care that much. Like, you know what I mean? Like if I had ended the year and been like, we made 950K, I wouldn't have given a shit at all. But to me, in my own experience, that's what's made it easier to get it, because it's so not charged and I'm not making decisions from that charged place. And so I think that that's a thing I see a lot of my clients go through too, is that it's almost like they have to get to a point where they release it enough that it's just for funsies, basically. Where so many of us come into it and we have a lot of proving and worth and like, you know, just value stuff tied up in that makes it so damn hard to go after.
I think that's so important, because, you know, around this whole conversation of like defining what's enough for you. And I think that's a lot of, you know, what ends up coming up through trying to figure out like, what is your well-being goal? Like, what's your enough? And like, is it the money or is it not? And I definitely don't want to like pretend like money isn't part of the conversation, but I think there's such a huge gap between like your financial safety number and like years, right? And so I think sometimes we almost like lift up the desire number so high that we don't even get to financial safety, and we think it's because we're not here, but it's actually because our baselines aren't met. Like if you can't sustainably pay rent, if you're feeling like, you know, that insecurity around the inconsistent income and not being able to plan it, like that's almost like a different problem to solve than like I'm not making figures. And one of the things that I went through really early on, and thank goodness for like the people in my life who like grounded me around this, was like I felt like it was a bottomless pit. Right? And I've seen this happen with a lot of my clients. It's like once you start making money, especially because you then start to like pour into expenses and you're like feeling like that desperation towards making more, money starts to go out, and then you feel like, oh, I need to make so much more in order to like take home what I want. And that can be such a like overwhelming feeling, because it feels like you're never going to get off that wheel.
Oh my God. I think I think you just described what happens to the vast majority of business owners in our industry, which is like, they keep pouring money into expenses and other things because they think it will make them more. And so then they end up spending so much of what they're making, and they're not even meeting basic needs, even though they can say they've made 100K or whatever. But it's such a trap in this industry to just overspend in hopes of making more. And it's a hamster wheel that gets impossible to get off of at some point because you're so over leveraged.
And I think like if you look at like what's under that, it's like that enoughness energy and that desperation energy, right? Is like you can like, of course there's parts of my business where I'm like, my investment ratio is like really high, but it feels really different when you know that like you're doing that to like, you know what I mean, create momentum versus if I don't have a coach, I can't be successful. If I can't spend, if I don't increase my spending, I can't hold this level of income. And I think like our brain starts to interweave these things when we're coming from a place of not enough around money.
Right.
Because we can think like, okay, well now I need to go find a different coach who charges more in order to be worth these prices. And our brain starts, I mean, like, no shame. Like this is like just the crazy mental gymnastics our brains do. And if we're not aware, right, we can really like be making money in the business and not having a feel good take home number. And I'm so passionate about that feel good take home number. And that's one of the things that I think really connected me to you was like, I saw that you were charging prices that were not like on par with the results that, you know, I saw other people charging in the space. And I was like, ooh, how does she like feel in her certainty around that? And so much of that was like the enoughness, like your enoughness was taken care of, that it didn't have to find its way into your pricing. And I think that's so powerful. And I think it could be helpful for us to talk a little bit about like how I frame it as freedom number, but there's so many articulations of like, even just setting a money goal and thinking about like, what's that number that gives you a good life experience versus like, what's the number that I feel like I need to prove something to the outside world?
I ask clients that all the time, especially when we're new or we're newly working together and stuff. And I like want to understand that about like what their money goals are. Is like, is this like what we need to like, you know, meet bare minimum expenses? Is this like a number you've made up because it's like more than your husband made and it's going to make you feel good to prove him wrong? Or like, what's the thing behind this? Like, I always want to know that because that impacts us so dramatically. And I've seen when clients shift that so much changes for them. Like I can think of one of my clients who, you know, she had forever in her business this goal of like, basically she was getting a certain amount of money each month from like family stuff. And she had this goal of like being able to replace that. But it was so not a driving factor because it was like, well, you're already getting the money and you're like underappreciating it and you're making it wrong and you're feeling super shitty about it. And your goal is to just like get this other money so that you don't feel super shitty about this. Like nothing about that is exciting or motivating or whatever. And as soon as, you know, we reworked what like a lot of that meant, it was like crazy how fast money came in. So I think that that's the key here is like, you can have literally any money goal you want, no shame in any of it, but like what's behind it is always the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on how you feel each day and how fast it comes.
Yeah, I think that's so key because like this is like a different way our brains want to not count the money and resources available to us and like, make it wrong for how it's coming in. And, you know, like I have clients who are pulling from savings while they're building their business for various reasons, whether they like intentionally saved up or whether their business didn't take off as quickly as they wanted to and they're having to dip into savings. Like, and it doesn't matter how much is in that savings either. It's like whether you've got like 3K or 100K, the brain still likes to do the same thing and be like, oh, it's not okay. Like this has to be saved, or you know what I mean? Like it goes into all of these things and it's like, well, it's not surprising that you don't want to like run at this, you know, big income goal because you're actually like really safe and financially set. And so like the motivation to do the things it would take to bring that in just aren't there. So like, how can we make it okay that you actually want to be slowing down? You just hate that you want to be slowing down. You know what I mean?
And the same is true when clients make a lot more money too. Like, so I've seen this with my clients making, you know, 7 figures and beyond. Is like at a certain point, the difference between like whatever 1.2 million and 1.8 million in a year, like it really, I mean, it sounds, you know, very obviously privileged to say, but it's like, it doesn't change your life experience that much. And so you have to have these factors that are motivating you outside of just a monetary goal, because there's always going to be a cap for how much that can drive you.
Yeah, I think that's that's so important. And like, that's the purpose of the money anyway, right?
Yeah.
And that feels like it's in alignment with that like whole concept of holding loosely. It's like, you're honoring yourself and putting yourself first in terms of like, these are my needs in the world. But then there's also this like a little bit available for the magic of like what's beyond that. You know what I mean? And that's where
absolutely
revenue share is kind of a fun, but very, you know, hard model if you're like not into that uncertainty. But it can be a really fun thing. And even in business, like I found that like, you know, that's when like you see clients like have money come in really unexpected ways, like for an offer they're not even promoting, or like that sales page has been taken down, and like the money just finds ways because there's not that like gripping onto it. And so I think that's so beautiful. And in terms of, you know, defining a freedom number, I think it's also super subjective, and it changes based on where you live and all of those things. So like, you know, like I have some clients who are abroad, and I know you do too. And so like the exchange there is different, right? Like if you make 5K in a country where the conversion rate is like great, that's like a 10K month here, but you don't get to say like, oh, I'm making 10K, but like, what does it get you?
Yep. And if you're just doing it to tell the internet you're making a certain amount of money, you're always fucked. Like, I mean, like that's the gist, right? Is like, and that's what, I mean, I like will ride my clients so hard about that. If they feel like they need to make it to prove something or to share it in some way or whatever, that is like the thing that I think is the most, harmful to ourselves and our self-concept, is this idea of like, I have to make this number so I can share it with strangers on the internet. Like that has to be like the biggest red flag of all time. And it happens to all of us. So I'm not saying like any shame if that's come up for you, but it like, we have to pay attention to that if it does.
Yeah. Ooh, okay. I have a question. I think I know the answer, but I really like your take on this. Is like, how do you bridge that gap if your vocation is related to helping people make money, and that number, especially like as a business coach, for instance, right? How do you kind of do that separation work of like, these are my numbers, and like, yes, they're tied to my marketing, but also like, I don't have anything to prove.
Yeah, I feel like what a person, a business coach, let's say, what a business coach is making has so fucking little to do with how they can help their clients. Like, and so for my clients, I think it's like important that they control the narrative around that. Like that's something I've always done in my business, because I've had clients making a lot more money than me at various points. And I've always like been really vocal about that and own that. I think where it gets detrimental is when we won't be vocal about that and be like, hey, just so we're clear, like, yes, I made this much money and it's cool and I'm happy to share it and like, I'm going to celebrate it. And it has literally nothing to do with how I can help you. That is what I think is so important. And we have to have other ways to explain how we can help people without it just being like, because I did this. Like, because those are vastly different things. Like being able to do something for yourself is very different than being able to help someone else do that. Like, you know, it's like in sports or whatever.
Yes.
How like most amazing coaches weren't the best players.
Yeah. I think about
and
that.
Most best players don't make the most amazing coaches. And so like, I think we just have to have a more nuanced conversation around that in our space. I think this idea of like, because I did it, I have a secret and can tell you is just so like not useful.
Yeah. I love your perspective on that, because it's something that I wasn't exposed to really early on. And then when I was exposed to it, I was like, it was really shifting, I think, for me, because it was like, oh yeah, this makes so much sense in most contexts. Like the money you make has nothing to do with like your abilities as a human, right? We definitely don't do that in like industries, right? We're not like a doctor has better inherent worth than, I don't know, a teacher, right? It's just like how the payments decided to work. But for some reason in the online space, we can do that. And I think a lot of it also is like cyclical, right? Like if we're marketing from like, I'm a good coach because I make this much money and I can help you make this much money, come hire me. Like it can be very, that enoughness is triggered, right? It's almost like you get to be made enough because I am enough. And so it creates that codependency versus like really understanding that like coaching is actually not about getting you the money because this person knows how to get you the money. It's about like someone who has the skills to coach you so that
Exactly.
you can be blocked around making the money.
I've thought about this so extensively because I feel like there's so many things that one time I just did this exercise for fun. This sounds so weird, but I feel like you're the person who will get this. But I did an exercise for fun that was like, if I wanted to, what would be all the shit I could use in my marketing? And I like went through and made this very long list of like, oh, I could share that I got this result and that I did this thing and that I have this many people on my wait list and blah, 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 blah. And like, it would be so easy for me to take all of that and package it up and then be like, and I will tell you exactly how to do that. And you should hire me because and honestly, I'd probably have 3 times as many people on my wait list as I do now if I did that. And it would inherently work. Like that marketing works. It just wouldn't inherently feel true for me. And that's why I don't do it. So, you know, it's like sometimes we can see like, oh, there's marketing that works really fucking well, but we can also decide to opt out of that if that doesn't feel good to us.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's so important. And like part of it is also just being integrity around like, where is the power, right? Like where is the power? And the power isn't in someone else, it's actually in you. And so coaching is like what strips that down, right? But it also means that like you then get to decide like, oh, you're the one who gets to create this money, and like what's going to get you to the money? Is it getting out of your own shit? Well, then that's when you hire a coach, and that makes sense. Or like maybe that's not the thing for you. Maybe you're like good mindset wise, but you're like needing some strategy around investments, and that's where like, you know, financial consulting makes sense. But there's like so many ways to build wealth outside of just like making more money in business and doing business activities that I think is also part of this conversation. And like what I think about as a full ass human. And I heard you talk about this recently, I think in your conversation around the $1 million and hitting that was like, our wealth is about so much more than just what we take home in the business. And the fact that like you can be a millionaire as a human and not have $1 million business. And like, what's that life experience? Which one is actually important? And why are we picking what we're picking? Because I think sometimes we can get real tunnel vision around like the only way that I get my goals is through the business, or the only way that I meet my needs is through the business. And the truth is most of us have other things available to us, whether that's, you know, like a second income because of a spouse or partner, whether that's like, you know, other investments, if you're doing your wealth and things like that. And like, we almost want to not count those things for whatever reason. And so I think that's also really important in the money conversation.
Totally. And I think like there's this weird thing again that we do in the online space where it's like $1 million business makes someone a millionaire. And that's not true at all, by the way. You can have $1 million business and be taking home $4,000 a month and definitely have no savings and no assets. And I mean, that's completely possible. Just like you can have not $1 million business and have $1 million net worth. Like, I think what you're referencing that I shared was how I was like a millionaire before I ever had $1 million business. And those things are just decidedly separate. But again, I think that we take it as like, well, if someone has $1 million business, they are an expert on wealth and finances and whatever. And it's such a slippery slope to do that because you have no idea what they're doing with their money and they don't need to explain it to you. They don't have to tell you. But like when we pedestal that person so much, that's when it gets dangerous, you know?
Absolutely. I found this to be true at the 6-figure mark a lot too.
Yeah.
And I think that's why like the target has moved, quite frankly, is like people built the 6-figure roadmap that they were teaching people based on like, get my high ticket coaching. And then to sustain that high ticket coaching, you need to make more. And so it's almost like the way that we teach you to build the 6-figure business is so expensive that to get a good take home, it now thinks you need a 7-figure business.
Oh my God, spot on. Yes.
And so
because you're basically spending 6 figures to make it. So you have to vastly increase that.
Which is not bad, but it's like, is it coming from a place of choice, right? Some people actually love the big team, the like many marketing channels and like that, like to hold that. But the point is, like, you and I both individually do not. We're very much one-on-one.
Yeah.
Right? But like, I also support clients who, like, I don't think anyone wants what I want of my clients. Like, nobody wants my model. And that's like not even the point. But the point is that, like, you know, are you building what actually feels good to hold at the end of it? Right? Because if you build it one way, like, either you get burnt out at the end, or then you have to shift gears completely and realize that you built something you don't actually enjoy.
Exactly. And no amount of money makes that worth it. Like, I think all of us have had some version of that experience in corporate or whatever, where it's like, no amount of money makes hating the thing you're doing worth it. And so that's so important too.
Totally. So I think it could be fun to share like our own personal money goals and how we're thinking about them this year. Because one of the things that I just love is like hearing people's kind of behind the scenes on that and how they're thinking about that. And I shared a post, I think it was almost a year ago now, and it didn't get necessarily like a ton of like, I mean, it got normal, but like, it wasn't super clear that like this was a viral post. But what I discovered is on my discovery calls, people were like, so this is the post that made me realize I wanted to hire you. And it was my post where I shared my freedom number, and I shared all the things I didn't want in my business, which was like, I didn't want a 7-figure business. I didn't want a whole bunch of team. I didn't want a whole bunch of different programs. I really loved going deep with a few people. And 350K was my freedom number. Like, me and my husband, we sat down, we mapped out like, if we live our dream life and kind of like even go into like extreme luxury, like what is that version of our life? And we're like, this is a 350K lifestyle. And so I shared that, and like, you know, people shared different reactions. Some of them was like, oh, it was kind of like, I almost judged you a little bit because I was coming out as a business coach at that time. And they were like, I thought that was kind of weird. But then they were like, oh, I realized that like I told myself I wanted $1 million business and I actually don't. And I was like, yeah, because you like the $1 million business doesn't mean anything if you're not looking at the expenses, right?
100%.
And like that number might be lower or higher depending on where you live and what you want. But I think like that number was like, I feel so like resonant with that number. What's interesting too is like, I've had this number for probably about like a year and a half maybe. And I found myself like shifting and expanding and desiring more even now, which is interesting because like I was very clearly at the time of that post, like not even interested in $1 million business. And I had my brain being like, actually, I'm not totally unavailable for that.
Right. Well, it's just like unavailable for what the industry tells you has to come with it is kind of the difference, right?
Yeah. And also like, I honestly like didn't want to like have to get there. But like now I like have pass and rev share is such a obvious one where like, if my clients like continue scaling, it's kind of inevitable that eventually I have to scale with them without having to necessarily like do things differently. And so how the money comes in matters so freaking much. And also just like the self-trust that like it isn't a bottomless pit, and like what would you do with the money, and like, oh, there are some fun things that now I can even see doing with that money. Because before it's like, if I have everything I want, all my needs met, like what do I need more for? And now it's like, oh, here's an idea, like the desire can build and shift. And that's something else I put in the post too, was like, and this all might change. But I think
exactly.
What's, like, so cool is also just like having to divorce more and more. I feel like since I've like had to claim that desire, it's also been like, ooh, how do I not like make it wrong that like I'm not there tomorrow or in 6 months? And if you're new here, like I started my business as a marketing consultant and a done-for-you provider. And last May, I fully shifted into business coaching. And I found it really hard to like be in that process of booking out and feeling like, oh, like now my income is dipping because I'm switching my model basically entirely. And I was really hard on myself, I think, at one point where I was like, oh, like now I'm giving up my 6-figure business status because I'm choosing to do what's alignment for me. And I had to be like, but why would I want a six-figure business in the thing that I don't love? And like, if it takes me an entire year to come back and match my income, like, is that really a terrible thing? And it's like, no, because then I could be doing that for like, years and years and be really happy and satisfied. And so I think, some of that detachment there has been so key for me. And also just like realizing the context. I think what the brain does is like, you made this much and you have to maintain it forever. And like,
it's also what our industry does, but yes, totally.
Yeah. And like, I didn't even recognize that, like, hey, I'm actually shifting my entire business model and I'm basically building a new business. But my brain was like, oh, like, and I think I see this happen a lot with clients and offers. Like, I just launched this new offer. People should be on board. They should be jumping in, or they don't want it because I've been talking about it for like 3 weeks, And I think just like allowing things to take time is such a big lesson and gift that I give to my clients and that I've like giving to myself over and over again. And I think that you modeled this really well with the $1 million business too.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want to talk about some of your journey around your number and like, when did you realize that you desired $1 million business and how long did it take you and what's money making this year versus what it's meant in the past?
Yeah, I think like, I kind of said this earlier, but I think the first thing was actually letting go of having to have it be a certain way. And then I would say probably in the last like 2 to 3 years, I've focused on it a little bit more. And I mean, not so much as like like obviously all like my lifestyle needs were met. So it wasn't really that, but it was more like I got really excited about the idea of this model creating that, like this idea of like my clients and I doing this together. And that's what really drove me, but it never felt super like important, I guess is what you could say. Like I did mindset work around it. I got really excited about it. I tried to like create fun and, reason behind it, but it never felt like, and this will prove something. It just felt like, and this will be like a cool experience to have. That's how I kept thinking about it. Like this will be a cool experience. And so, yeah, but again, like things can take time. That was my goal for multiple years. Like I was building up to it. I wouldn't say it was let me reframe that. I also like, when I have a big goal, I'll still set like a feels like a more realistic goal for that year too, if that makes sense. Like, so like last year, I think my goal was like 700, but I was still like doing $1 million mindset work.
Yes.
I don't know if that makes sense, right?
Totally does.
And then this year, like I'm having a baby. So I really don't give a shit. I don't have a number goal at all this year. If we hit $1 million again, I will celebrate that. If we don't, I will own that completely and be like, give myself more than enough grace that like, I don't have to make a human and $1 million in the same year. That feels like a lot.
When you say it like that, it's like, wow, it's crazy that we hold that expectation, but we really do.
We really do. Yeah. Like, I think, if I come out next year and say, hey, this was the year I had a baby and we didn't make $1 million, I think there will be some people that are like, oh, gasp almost. You know what I mean? Like how,
okay.
But I think it's totally possible that we do make $1 million. Like I just feel open to it either way. But what I'm definitely decided not to do is like attach that pressure to it this year. Like that's something I was like so intentional about. Like it was so great to celebrate that in 2021. So happy with that. But like,
yeah.
I refuse to have that pressure on myself on top of that this year, because I just know that's how I could go crazy and I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting is like sometimes we need that like tangible thing, but I think for many of us, like that thing, that's the reason why we're not like running at a money goal in the season. Like we can't point to it as concretely as a baby, but like it's so present and true for us. And I find that to be true with like clients who are like dealing with mental health stuff or like who have, even moms or like, for me this year, it's like my health and my marriage are like number 1 and 2. And so like, not that I have to pick, but like if ever these are in conflict, I'm just like really clear where my time and energy is going to go to.
Yeah.
But it also is possible that like that level of detachment is going to create the money too. And
right.
I
Well,
think,
like for example, with maternity leave, if my goal was to make $1 million this year, then it would be counterintuitive to take as much maternity leave time as I'm taking, which is over three months. I mean, like really, it's like almost 4. So that would be completely at odds with each other. So I just know that like the money goal isn't more important than that.
yeah, I think another conversation I've been having a lot with clients and the moment in my business where things clicked was like realizing that I'm in this for the long term. And like,
Exactly.
I think that makes the micro so much less important when we're like, okay, like I have plenty of time to get there. And so I think that's what I'm hearing you share around maternity leave is like, I'm going to come back and like next year can be a 7-figure year. Like I'm going to have so much time. This is literally what I love to do. I'm going to keep doing it. And so it's not like if I don't do it in this amount of time, then there's no opportunity for me to do it or I failed.
Totally. Or to add to that, not an and, or I mean, not an or, but an and to add to that, like, and I wouldn't not do it if I wasn't going to make $1 million from it. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not like $1 million or it's not fucking worth it. I don't feel like that at all. So
Yeah.
it kind of doesn't matter. Like, I'm going to keep doing this regardless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's why I think it is like the celebration and the counting, all of it is so key to that because that's what makes you realize like the progress that like nobody else is probably going to celebrate you for, but like you, and if you have like a safe space with a coach or like someone in your life who can really see you in all of those like micro progresses to make you like stay in it long enough to see the macro results.
Absolutely.
So we had a couple of questions being
Sure.
submitted that I want to make sure that we get to. And then if y'all have, let me see. Okay, we've got a couple here. So
Okay.
this one is, how long does it take to reach $1 million?
I mean, I think
the answer.
yeah, like I think the answer is it really just depends. Like I have clients who've done it in less than a year and it took me 6, and I have clients who've done it in longer than 6. Like it, I don't think there's an exact timeline. And I think, but the point that I want to make in that answer is that that's why all this bullshit that gets sold to us of like, if you just do these exact steps, it always happens in this exact amount of time is really damaging and confusing. Because if you line up every client I have that's making $1 million, all of their timelines were very different.
I love
And
that.
so like there isn't one is kind of the point. It's just like running your own race, which is annoying, right? Like it would be nice if there was, but yeah.
It totally is. But I think also like, I think question one is like, do you want $1 million business?
Yeah.
And because I think like the million can feel far in some ways, but like, again, locking into like your freedom number and your take home and your life experience, like that number is probably a lot lower than $1 million. And so I think that can give you a lot of hope in that in between, because there's so many ways to create happiness below that level. And then you can kind of do that detachment work of like, it takes as long as it takes, and like being available depending on your business model, right? Because your business model is like coaching, right? And so is mine. Like the million might take a little bit longer versus
100%.
if you're scaling, something that's like high ticket groups, like you need less to make that money. But if you don't want to hold the group, it's going to feel like a grind to do it in that way. And so I think just like walking into like what makes sense for your business model is also helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Let's see, we've got, okay, what strategy allowed you to prioritize profit in your business? And then alongside that, we have a similar one. What's a healthy profit expense ratio? I'm going to answer the profit expense ratio real quick. And then, so I've heard a lot of different things, and like, we're not financial consultants, but from working with, my bookkeeper and accountant, I think they usually say like, they want to see expenses below 40% typically. And I think it depends on what season you're in business and like what your model is. And I think like the more money you make, the more that percentage goes down, obviously. So I usually find that with myself and with clients who like do the fast growth route, where we're investing quite a bit to make it to that 10K month mark roughly, like you're going to see maybe like more of like 60% investment and like you're taking home less. Or I know some people who like make zero. I think if you grossed it, like I made like $2,000 my first year in business because I reinvested everything back into the business. But then after that, it was like that number flipped. And so I think it really depends. But I think like if you're long-term living outside of the 50-50 ratio and that's not feeling good, like that's probably time to look at things.
I agree with everything you said. The one other thing I would add to that too is that sometimes it also depends on like what your priorities are in life. I think too, like for some of my clients that want to work 15 hours a week or something like that, they're operating at a higher expense ratio. They just are, because they have way more team that's working on their behalf kind of thing. And they've decided that they're more than okay with that profit margin because it's what allows them to get this other thing that they really want. So that's important to think about too, is like definitely what you said about seasons in terms of like your growth trajectory, but also seasons in terms of your desires and priorities.
Absolutely. Oh, this is a really deep question. I think this is the last one we'll have time to take. How do you define prosperity in business?
I mean, I feel like this is a very cheesy answer, but it's what it is. But when I used to work in the nonprofit world, I would drive to work every morning. I tell this story a lot because I think about it constantly, but I would drive to work every morning and I had like the dream job, right? Like I was super young. I had this like really, like great position. I was making good money for my age, like all of those things. And I would drive to work every day and be like, this cannot be what this is supposed to feel like. And I would like look at other people in their cars and be like, do other people feel like this? Is this a me thing? Is there something wrong with me? Like this should not be how this feels to have like the dream job and the dream marriage. And like, this does not feel like that. And so for me, like prosperity, and the reason I like use the term MillionHer is like feeling like you are living the dream no matter what, feeling like you have the $1 million business no matter what, feeling amazing in it. Like to me, that's sustainable, that's prosperity, that's abundance. And so it's maybe attached to money in some ways, and not like I think you have to have a certain amount of money to be able to feel like all is well, right? But it's so detached from money in other ways, in the sense that it has so much more to do with like how you're feeling in the experience versus like what money you're making. Because I had like everything that looked perfect, but it didn't feel perfect, you know?
I love that example because it's like so concrete. We can all kind of walk into that kind of a moment in our lives. I think if
that's like what I ask myself all the time. Like if I don't wake up going, is this all there is? I'm in prosperity. I'm in abundance.
Such a good filter.
Yeah.
My answer is kind of similar, but I think the way that I think about that is like feeling like the inside reflects the outside. And I think for me, like prosperity is when I feel like what's in my heart and what like I desire is like reflected in my outside. And like it could be a micro version, a flavor of that. But I think where we can feel intention and not in prosperity is when we feel like who we are or whatever we're connected with inside of us isn't being reflected in our outer world, whether that's like we're not living in our purpose doing the kind of work we want to do, or like we feel like we're worth the money but we're like not actually seeing money, or we're desiring, you know what I mean, like that lack of like, integration of the inside and outside worlds, I think can cause a lot of
congruence is not there.
And so like the fix is always different, right? Sometimes you have to change the internal, sometimes you have to change the external. But I think prosperity is like when you feel like those things are like aligning, it feels so freaking good. And
totally.
And so, yeah, that's how I would define it, is your inside world and your outside world feel integrated and congruent.
I love that. So beautiful. Well, thank you so much for having me and for having this conversation. I loved talking to you about this. I think it's so important. I think it's something so needed.
I appreciate you too. And I think it's such a gift for people to be able to hear this. And I think you just have such an interesting, grounded perspective on this. And so I appreciate you taking the time, especially with baby coming soon.
Yes.
To do this.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, y'all.
All right. Bye, guys.